Could I just go back to your opening statement, Ms. Scoggin, in relation to a number of issues? In various parts of your statement, you outline, for example, that consumers in this regard, financial services, were extremely vulnerable. You then go along to say that the CCPC's view that how financial institutions have treated their customers is totally unacceptable. Customers have been categorically let down. Regardless of the financial crisis, consumers' contracts should have been and must be honoured. What are you going to do about it?
Thanks, Deputy. As we outlined at the beginning, the role where we have a specific mandate in relation to financial services is consumer information and education. So we will do our part there in making sure that consumers are educated to know what they're getting into. What we do have concerns about is areas where products, including financial services products, are deliberately made extremely complex, or where they are deliberately sold on the basis of something which is not the most important element of it. So, for instance, in our mortgages options paper, we recommended that we should have a good look at things like cash discounts and cash back and so on for mortgages, where people are encouraged to get into, can be encouraged to get into a very expensive mortgage or a mortgage that doesn't suit the needs of the consumer by these kind of upfront incentives, because we know perfectly well that people kind of tend to go for these and not really understand the long-term implications, because they're getting into a contract that's going to be 20, 25, 30 years. So we would look at issues like that, and that's where I think we can bring our specific lens to bear. The enforcement of these, as we've said, there are two agencies, if you like, already in that space of enforcement. We do have the enforcement powers under the Consumer Protection Act 2007, but they are the same enforcement powers as the central bank, which also has.
Can I interrupt you there? Let's just measure the very fine language that would be, accepted by most in the context of your opening statement, and what has happened. So, in 2009, a bank dragged a customer, or the customer dragged the bank, kicking and screaming, to the courts. That's 2009. So since then, under enormous pressure from all sorts of individuals and groups, the banks have been exposed as not only taking money from customers where they should not have taken it, but of keeping that money. Theft. I reckon that in one bank alone, from memory, that some 20 houses have been lost, family homes have been lost. So alongside that then, you have the same type of action being taken by each bank. And you say that that's because they were losing their shirt on tracker mortgages. Well, I'm asking you, as someone who is to protect the consumer, who is to look at the banks in terms of cartel-like activities, what do you say to those people who didn't just lose their shirt, they lost their houses? They felt that they were disgraced through the banks. Their credit rating was torn to shreds. Their lives were devastated. We've had all of the witnesses in here before us. And what do you say to them? What are you going to do with the banks? Because both of you, Mr. Deering and yourself here this morning, have spoken about the culture that exists in the banks. But I don't see you doing much for the consumer. I don't see you doing much for the individual out there. And I don't see you doing much for the effort that is needed to break the banks from a role where they see themselves as being in a position to rip off the customer whenever they choose. I get no sense of that from you.
Well, Chairman, I think there's common agreement that the best way to deal with this and to achieve redress for those consumers, and I mean, I think that's the absolute #1 priority, is to achieve redress for those consumers. There are other priorities, including making people accountable for what happened, but the best tools or the best weapons in the armoury for doing that is the investigation that's being carried out by the central bank, because they can deal with that number of people. I mean, we're an agency of 90 people. I'm not complaining about that. I'm saying I think we do a good job with the numbers that we have, but, you know, there's 20 times that number in the central bank. They're not all focused on consumer protection, but they are the agency.
Before us.
Yeah.
I'm talking about you and your organisation.
But,
and it appears to me, from what you have said here this morning, that you are doing nothing for those people that have been seeking redress since 2009. And the fact that we're in this space today, in terms of what the banks are now responding to, came about by a whole different pressure. So the question for you here today is, what are you going to do with the banks? Because it appears to me, from answers you gave to Senator Burke, that you're relying on information to come to you. Now, you're, I'm sure, aware of what's going on around you in this country and in the state. And looking at the likes of Maurice McCabe and others, do you think any whistleblower will put their head up over the parapet and come and tell you what you need to know about the banks? And just to reinforce that comment, look at what happened to the 2,000 or so employees of the Bank of Ireland who asked for redress in terms of their tracker mortgage. And they were told by the new CEO of that bank that they wouldn't be considered because they were legally literate. That was the comment. So how do you match up what you're doing or not doing with that type of culture, that type of response from the banks, and the fact that consumers continue to believe that they are being ripped off and treated badly by banks that have obviously, by some magic happening, come to the same point at the same time about these trackers?
In relation to consumers, as I say, we cannot, it's not within our power to get redress for those consumers. It is within the power of the central bank. Therefore, I think it has to be the central bank that deals with those individual cases, that gets redress, that does it properly. And they have an obligation, again, the central bank have an obligation, if they have evidence of theft or fraud, to report that to the guards in the same way.
You're consumer protection, aren't you? Consumer
we are.
So what do you do? Tell me what you do. What are you doing to stop this nonsense in the bank? This is still going on. Remember that the Bank of Ireland suddenly, I think, produced another 6,000 lot of customers that were affected. And we still don't know today, as we go into Christmas, whether or not they've dealt with all of the numbers in the bank. They are so reluctant. KBC were before us and showed such disrespect to their customers and this committee that they didn't even give us the figures. So you are the agency, you represent the agency with the power to do something. So what is your agency doing? I keep on asking you, what are you doing to determine whether or not there was a cartel in operation? What are you doing to speak to people? Only today you used the committee, and it's only today I've heard it from you, to ask whistleblowers to come forward. Why didn't you do it earlier? Why are you not to the fore in relation to this?
I suppose the reason we're not to the fore is that there is a specific regulatory agency in the financial services sector with the powers to carry out investigations and to get redress. Now, in relation to our own role in competition, what we have not seen is any specific evidence that we can use to ground an investigation. And I suppose the reason I'm saying it here, and I have said it previously, that if there are people with information as to that, that they should come forward. I mean, you mentioned the number of people that there are in the banks. You know, there must be people who are sufficiently annoyed with the banks, even current or former employees of the banks. There must be people who are sufficiently annoyed that they would face the undoubted difficult task of being a whistleblower and come forward if there is evidence to give us. But, you know, the whole thing goes beyond that. I mean, what I would love to find out is what was going on in the banks. How were people rewarded? Did people get a bonus for wrong selling the thing? But I mean, that's something that I think has to come out of the central bank's investigation.
Don't we know that they did? Wasn't it said that they got a bonus? Isn't there enough hearsay evidence there to at least spark you into action, to scratch around the surface and see, can you unearth an employee or employees of various banks to come forward and tell you? How else do you collect your information? Are you going to wait for people to come to you, or are you going to go out there and actively ask people, have you seen or have you heard, will you come forward?
Well,
we did it today,
yeah.
But it's a bit late.
But, I mean, bear in mind, the central bank has been investigating this for 7 to 8 years. They have an obligation to tell us if they come across any evidence of cartel-type arrangements. An obligation. I mean, it's not a facility to tell us. It's an actual legal obligation to do so. We've been in constant contact with them over the issue, and it just hasn't happened to date.
Jonathan Sugarman went to the central bank and told them a story about his bank that would shock anybody. And I doubt if he had it all back again that he would come forward, because that bank that he complained about was not investigated the way it should have been. So that is the experience of a whistleblower. So therefore much more needs to be done to unearth the information that is required to take a case. And that's why I would expect on the, you know, on your side of the house, as it were, far greater action. And I don't, honestly, I don't see it. I don't see it. All we see here is, and here at this meeting, time and time again, is how the consumer is being ripped off, how information is being withheld from that consumer to take any kind of a case, how when they come forward, records of meetings go missing, tape recordings go missing, and then suddenly, if they're really pushed to it, if the energy is there on the side of the consumer, the bank they may stand down and they may give in to a certain extent. But as you saw from the various witnesses that we had here before us and heard from them, they're worn down by the banks and what they're doing to them. And they turn to agencies like yours for help and assistance. And it begs the question, are you afraid of the banks? It really does. Are you afraid to take on the banks in such a way as to make it clear to them that you are about your business? Do what they did about the planning issues many years ago. Put an ad in the paper. Ask the employees, will they come forward? Ask them, have they a story to tell? Because the stories that I hear would make the hair stand on your head in relation to the banks. I didn't believe them in the beginning. And it wasn't, we got the correspondence and had the hearings here, that the stories got worse and worse. And you still haven't satisfied me anyway that you're doing anything to represent the consumer or anything to break what essentially is a cartel.
Chairman, as I've explained in relation to criminal procedure, hearsay evidence is no use to us. We cannot institute a criminal investigation on the basis of hearsay evidence. If such evidence if true evidence comes forward that we see will stack up, we have absolutely no fear of we've taken on some of the biggest companies in the state, we've taken on major industries. We are not behind the door when it comes to putting ourselves forward and doing that, but we have to make a decision based on what's the best place to put our resources. In relation to the consumer redress, as I've said, there are already 2 state agencies which I believe to be extremely committed to trying to get resolution for consumers in this, and they have the whole experience of the sector. They know what they're doing. I don't see that we can do more than we are already doing in relation to consumers without tripping over each other and, in fact, complicating the landscape for consumers. I absolutely believe that we have to plough through the process with the central bank and with the Ombudsman there as backup in order to get that form of redress for consumers. But going forward, I just think we have to come to the end of that process, and then we have to have the report from the central bank, and we have to look at that and say, what exactly was going on in there? Because I still think there's a lot of transparency and opaqueness about it, about what was going on, about the kind of practices. Who directed it? I mean, where does this go? Does this come down from the very top within the banks, and were people given orders to do this?
It wasn't someone at the front desk that decided about the tracker mortgage issue. Mm-hmm. I think that has to be accepted. It wasn't someone at the front desk that dictated the interest rates. It wasn't someone at the front desk that decided, you know what, we just won't answer them and we'll tell them that we have no records, that we have no phone records. And it wasn't someone at the front desk that decided to, in the case of PTSB and that case, that decided, what exactly to do in that case. None of them were at the front desk. It was in the boardrooms of these banks that the decision was made. So if each board of each bank made the same decision at the same time, that stinks of a cartel. And that's what the Irish people believe. And they believe that the agencies of this state that are there to protect them stood idly by from 2009 up to recently when this whole thing blew up. Have you ever spoken to Pádraig Kazan?
No, I haven't, but I know who he is and I'm aware of the testimony that he gave before the committee.
Would you not think it perhaps that it would be an interesting conversation for you to have with him?
It would be an interesting conversation, but I can't see how he would have evidence of anti-competitive agreements between the banks. I'm aware
you don't
of his...
know, you haven't asked him.
But again...
That's the point that Senator Burke, I think, is making.
Yeah.
If someone is trying to gather some evidence, tell me the effort made to gather it. You haven't asked Mr. Kazan, you haven't, I'm sure, asked many more of the individual customers that there. We have emails here which I obviously can't go through because of the fact that they're individual emails. But they're from people that worked in the banks. And they express, the concern about what was happening in the banks at that time. In fact, one individual, when I read the email, lo and behold, within 10 days after coming up here at the committee, the bank decided to compensate her. Mm-hmm. But her biggest fear was that she worked in the bank. And she was afraid of losing her job. That's why they rely on someone like you. So, have you spoken to Mr. Kazan, by the way, Mr. Leary?
I have.
How did you find him?
He has a very good grasp, as we all know, on this whole area. He has been speaking to a lot of different complainants. Indeed, he has complaints before our office as well. So, yes, he has a very strong knowledge of the area.
See, worthwhile, Mr. Cogan. It's very worthwhile.
Mm-hmm. I'm aware that Mr. Kazan has a lot of evidence and information about the relationships between individual consumers and their banks. What we are looking for is evidence of contacts between the banks.
But you don't know whether he has that information or not.
He's a very well-informed individual. I would expect that if he had that information, he would have come to us, because I think he would know perfectly well.
You're getting paid to do your job. Why don't you ask him?
I certainly will ask him. Yeah, thank you for the tip.
A bit late again, isn't it?
There's developments happening all the time in this market.
Oh, there is, yes. Since 2009. Mm-hmm. Slowly. Very, very slowly when it comes to the consumer. And I honestly think that your attitude in this is one of express it loudly and clearly and condemn it, but very little real action to tackle banks or to tackle the interests, support the interests of the consumer. And I'm really disappointed that is the case. Can I ask you, Mr. Deering, in relation to Ulster Bank, for example, and the Global Restructuring Group, and maybe this is a question for both of you, because this is a tracker issue type as well. What is happening in relation to that? Are you investigating it?
Chairman, as you appreciate, I can't actually. Our investigations and complaints have to be dealt with in private, so I can't comment on any one institution.
Okay, well then let's put it this way. There was restructuring groups or elements to each of the banks, and a number of complaints are now emerging in relation to how these banks dealt with the restructuring of good commercial loans and some bad commercial loans that were bundled together for the same individuals. And there seems to be no let-up or outcome to it. So in the context of that and the current tracker issue, does that sit into the tracker issue, or is it something that's been dealt with separately?
If we received a complaint in that area, Deputy, Chairman, it would depend on whether, if there was a tracker element, certainly it would sit into the tracker. If it was, there are other commercial loans there as well that would be looked at. And basically, you're probably aware that the Consumer Protection Act in 2005 took care of the situation, for example, where restructuring or loans were sold on, because there could have been a problem where a regulated entity sold a loan to a non-regulated entity. That would have taken them, for example, out of our reach to deal with complaints. But the Consumer Protection Act in 2015 makes sure that the person either provides a credit intermediary who is regulated, or that they provide a credit intermediary, or that the firm has gone to is regulated. So that in a situation like that, we can still deal with complaints if it has been moved to another entity. And in fact, in some instances, we find we have two complaints, because we may have a complaint where something happened before it was passed on, and that would be against the originating financial service provider, and then something has happened with the new entity that it has been sold to. So we can deal with situations. Simply because something transfers from one to another wouldn't prohibit us, but we would need a complaint from the individual or the person concerned. And just an important point, and I know it's an area you're interested in yourself, we can take complaints from businesses as well, as long as the turnover is less than 3 million. I think sometimes there's an impression that the Financial Services Ombudsman can only deal with individuals. So we do deal with individuals, small businesses, clubs, organisations as well.